and we are here with Jack Swartzinski, who's a student at Eastern Michigan University, who I've known quite some time, and he is working hopefully towards a law degree at some point. I think that's the plan, isn't it, Jack?
Yes, that's the plan. Hopefully, law school sometime after undergrad.
Your junior year to senior year, is that where you're at?
Yeah, that's where I'm at now. I'm getting the finals done for my junior year right now.
Quarantine finals, yes.
Yeah,
Always to get
quarantine finals in Ypsilanti. So
done. So we thought, one of the things that we get a lot of questions at, a lot of interest at from the general public at the Lenawee Historical Museum is the Civil War. I mean, part of that's the anti-slavery Underground Railroad movement that was in Lenawee County, but there always seems to be a huge attraction about the American Civil War. And some of it's battle related. There's no doubt about that, Fourth Michigan, White Woodbury. But Jack was going to join us today, talk a little bit about the political process behind it. And then to me, what's the more interesting story is the Reconstruction afterwards.
Yeah. So we're going to be talking about basically the big focus is going to be on Reconstruction and the methods that the southern states went about and the United States as a whole went about Reconstruction and what that ultimate goal seemed to be for that. We're going to touch a little bit on, and I'm going to share my screen now with this little PowerPoint that I made up earlier today. Basically culminating with the implementation of the 14th Amendment during Reconstruction. And how that was an important part of Reconstruction. And I think ultimately for many Union abolitionists, the ultimate goal of Reconstruction.
Not to interrupt you, Jack, but one of the interesting statistics that I saw recently, what is it, something like 2/3 of case law at the Supreme Court is argued over the 14th Amendment?
Yeah, absolutely. It's next to the Bill of Rights. It's ultimately the most important amendment. And quite frankly, and as we'll get into in this video, because not a lot of Americans know about this, it ultimately makes the Bill of Rights important because of the fact that before the 14th Amendment, the Bill of Rights weren't incorporated to the states. It wasn't a part of state law. So it was only pertinent to federal instances, which we'll get into a greater example of this as we go through this a little bit. But basically starting off with, we see the state convention system pre-war. Obviously, since the United States was a new country and the focus was on state governments for a long, long time have been holding a lot of different conventions, specifically on how power would be separated between their own governor branches and the state legislature, which is interesting right now since we seem to be going through a period in the middle of the coronavirus where there's kind of concerns on how that power is divvied up. But what we basically see is three big things kind of pop up. As one is that this was the mechanism for secession, and it would also be the mechanism for being brought back into the United States. But many of these votes, many of the states selected and voted to secede from the Union by having these conventions, and that's the driving motivator when you look at these conventions and how they're being talked about. It was definitely about the formation of a slave oligarchy. And that kind of is proven by the 2/3 provision in the Confederate Constitution that would require any state that the focus was definitely on states that had legal slavery, had allowed slavery. And they basically made a provision in the Confederate Constitution that would require that if a state wanted to join the Confederacy but didn't want to allow slavery, they would need a 2/3 majority vote in the House and Senate of the Confederacy in order to be allowed into the Confederacy. So it was very clearly designed to promote the trade of slavery. And they also displayed during these meetings a lot of dissent over the idea of whether secession was a good idea or not. These conventions in South Carolina have been talking about secession since the late 1840s. But that kind of leads us into the early Reconstruction era, where at the end of the war, the method in which the states were going to go about being readmitted is through the state conventions again. And this started up as early as January of 1864, a full year and some months before the war had actually ended and when the final shots were fired. And this was done in Arkansas and basically any Union area controlled in the South. And President Johnson's initial goals were fairly light. They were going to be focused on basically acknowledging the abolition of slavery with the passage of the 13th Amendment. But it left a lot of questions open. It was Johnson saw himself as much more of an advisor in these positions rather than an actual, someone who's supposed to dictate the terms of this situation.
And really, this is a continuation of Lincoln's policy, isn't it? Where it was he didn't really particularly care how the war came to an end. He viewed the states as never really leaving the Union.
Exactly. It was much more along those sorts of lines. And that's the interesting thing about the Civil War is that it is referred to in our official history books in the Library of Congress and however is as the Great Rebellion of 1861 to 1865. The term Civil War can kind of throw things into a little bit of a weird language pinch. But yeah, it was definitely the official position of the United States government that it was a rebellion and that the states didn't actually leave, which creates a bit more complicated situation as we'll get into a bit later. But there was a lot of questions at these conventions as the Southern states started hosting them. Was the major question of compensation for the loss of slavery, the compensation for any debts that anyone had put into the cause, the Southern cause. For instance, if there were, you were a rich landowner and had given money to the Confederacy, were you owed compensation back? There were those sorts of questions. And that led basically to Congress with the new radical Republicans being brought in, dictating a lot stronger terms, treating the Southern states in a much more authoritative way. This was where you saw the military districts set up to oversee the readmittance of former Confederate states, as well as the making sure that the former slaves were actually being freed, and as we'd see later under Grant, one of the greatest anti-domestic terrorism campaigns against the Ku Klux Klan. So it was that formation, and that also required that the former Confederate states recognize the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments in order to be readmitted. And this caused a little bit of question of how the states were going about this, because the radical Republicans at one point were being a little tricky on, well, if you're not, how the state government actually was in making these decisions, and also how states counted towards amendments, because to ratify an amendment, you need 2/3 of states to approve that amendment. So there was this kind of, there was a bit of difficulty, but in any case, the 14th Amendment was introduced by John Bingham, who was a congressman from Ohio, and it was passed by Congress on June 13th, 1866. And this was basically framed in the sense that it wasn't like the 13th Amendment, which was strictly for the liberation of people who had been formerly under slavery in the United States, but this was going towards the rights of almost every single American, because of the fact that there was a law. And this is actually an interesting thing about this, is that John Bingham had to bring in the case law into Congress when they were debating this issue, because of the fact that his fellow congressmen didn't believe the fact that the first 10 amendments didn't actually apply to the states. But under the Supreme Court many Supreme Court rulings before the Civil War, your right to free speech, your right to own a firearm, your right to privacy, any of those basic rights under the Bill of Rights didn't apply automatically to the states unless the states had already made similar codes in their own laws. So this was an even broader picture. This was from an intellectual standpoint towards human rights in total. And I think that's a really important thing to hit on right here. But it was definitely geared towards the protection of formerly freed slaves and actually being able to give them due process rights. And it was finally officially ratified in July of 1868. So we're going to go this because there are 5 sections to the 14th Amendment. I won't read this since it's up on the screen. You'll be able to read it yourself. Basically, the first section, which is the most important section, guarantees number 1, birthright citizenship, which means that, which is directly tied to the former slaves, since the fact that there's many southern states had started putting in black codes, preventing black people from being able to vote in that in that state. This basically gave blanket citizenship to anyone who was born in this country, which covered all of the formerly freed slaves. It also expanded protections for privilege or immunities, prevents the states from denying due process and equal protection under the law. But we have to look at privilege and immunities first and foremost, because that's what brings in the first 10 amendments. That's what brings in every other amendment passed in the United States Constitution to apply to the states. And that leads us, another section, section 2. It's important to note, and this is why the 19th Amendment would be so important later on, is the fact that it does make a distinction between male and female citizens in the United States.
And this, again, this was an argument, that goes back to the 1830s and 1840s with the early abolitionists. Seneca Falls happens in the 1850s, and it's something that's clearly on their minds in the abolitionist realm, and you can see it here in the constitutional document.
Yeah, and absolutely, and it's rebuking that movement, and that's what obviously make people like Susan B. Anthony very frustrated during this time, because of the fact that before you could say that the language of the law was fairly broad in defining what these protections were for, who these protections were for. But in this moment, probably the most obvious downside in this amendment is that male distinction in this case. But it also sets up a punishment for states to prevent citizens from voting. And I think that's one of the things that we have to remember in the 14th Amendment, is that it is a congressional amendment. It is meant to give Congress the power to punish those states that deny their citizens due process, deny their citizens the right to vote, deny their citizens their right to bear arms, to free speech, what have you. And that's very clear in the writing of this amendment. And moving on to section 3, this is a more historical section of it, basically banning anyone who had previously served. So if, let's say you're talking about Robert E. Lee, who had previously served in the United States military. And he then goes off and serves in the Confederate military. He can no longer hold a position of authority in the United States government. He can't run for Congress. He can't hold a military position in that way, unless he get a 2/3 vote in the House, allowing and removing that bar. So it's more of an historical barring there that isn't as important today, unless we have another rebellion. But in section 4 of this, we basically go at, kind of goes to that earlier question of property and of compensation for former slaveholders, basically saying that it's preventing the United States government from taking on those debts from the Confederacy, and also big time most importantly, prevents former slaveholders from being compensated for their loss of property or the loss of their slaves. So that's another historical and important part of this section. The most important part, and this is the part that it's a very small, it's the shortest line of all, and but it's included in almost every amendment put into the Constitution today, and that is that Congress shall have the power to enforce by appropriate legislation the provisions of this article. So that almost gives the Congress power to interpret this amendment and to apply this amendment to the states as they wish. And the Supreme Court isn't going to like that very much at all. And we're going to see that with the slaughterhouse cases of 1873. Now, the thing about the slaughterhouse cases is that they were actually about in New Orleans, there were massive cholera outbreaks from basically this rotting animal flesh being thrown into the river. And so to combat this, the state basically made a monopoly, making all the other butchers to come into this one slaughterhouse, pay these guys a fee in order to process their product. And so they sued under the grounds of the 13th and 14th Amendment, of the fact that they had they're being forced to do this against their will, against their, basically calling it a badge of slavery, as the court would go on in different language in the future. But they would also say that this went against their due process rights. And Justice Miller, who led the majority opinion for the court, basically went out and said that the first 10 amendments and the 13th, 14th Amendment, well, 14th Amendment doesn't incorporate those rights to the states. And these guys had the Bushes had lost all the way up through the Louisiana courts and then up to the Supreme Court before it got there. But and this is basically what the court ruled, is that the 14th Amendment only pertained, and went beyond that and said that the 14th Amendment only pertained to free slaves, did not apply the Bill of Rights of the state, and could only be applied federally. So in locations like ports or interstate commerce, that sort of thing, which flies in the face of what Congressman Bingham and what the framers of the 14th Amendment were trying to do. This is one of those cases where the Supreme Court basically, in the way I see this and the way I read it, denied what was deliberately written in the Constitution. There was dissent on the Supreme Court in saying that the 14th Amendment did incorporate the Bill of Rights to the states and apply to all Americans. But this had a major effect on the Reconstruction era going forward, in the fact that it prevented people from being able to, basically, people weren't guaranteed their rights under the Bill of Rights in this country at the state level until the 1920s and gradually over time throughout the civil rights period. So it basically caused the death of Reconstruction right here. Even though it technically goes on until 1879, this is when this, I think, is the first moment that really kills the Reconstruction movement and the chance of really incorporating the former slaves into the American society.
It's definitely a unique time frame in American history that really gets skipped over in a lot of classes because, post-Civil War Reconstruction history, you hear about the military occupation, you hear about, maybe there may be some things in there about voter intimidation, some things about, the Freedmen's Bureau and the Freedmen Bureau with the banking laws. But really, this is a unique time frame in both northern and southern states where you see things like charters being written into state constitutions to require taxpayers to fund local school municipalities. Large African-American participation at both the state and federal level. And like you say, this particular Supreme Court case, and within 6 years, you're dealing with a solid Jim Crow South at that point.
Yeah, it's from that point that, whereas before you had the election of black senators and black congressmen and state legislatures actually starting to reflect the population. It was right after this that we start seeing that slow ramping up of Jim Crow and basically the new caste system for the South that would rule for the next 100 years.
And it, very interesting for, at least Lenawee County history that have been very active in the anti-slavery movement, the more illegal Underground Railroad aspect of it. This is a time frame when, 1870s, people like Laura Haviland and Elizabeth Comstock, who had been very active in the Underground Railroad, very active in the war cause, supporting the troops, and then after the war, were working with the Freedmen's Bureau. Look at the South and they start to tell African Americans that are living there, this isn't going to work. Let's move out to Kansas. Let's move out to the Great Plains, out to the West Coast. And that's why you see the growth of the middle America at that point, with large concentrations of African Americans living there.
Absolutely. I'm going to need to read into Lenawee County's Underground Railroad and Reconstruction efforts there a bit more.
There's a book out there, Jack. I may have put one together for you. Well, hey, Jack, I wanted to thank you, for taking time out of your schedule today to be with us and share a little bit to people that are watching here on Lenawee County Historical Society's Facebook page.
No problem. This is going to be, this is all a little preparation stuff for my senior thesis. So this was definitely a really good step to help me push towards research, and I really appreciate the opportunity to share this stuff.
Cool. Thanks, Jack.
Thank you.